Hey Internet, I'm Simon Squibb, your host at the Good Luck Club podcast. Our mission is to help anybody out there that's thinking of starting a business. Equally, if you've started a business and are struggling, maybe you need a little bit of inspiration and knowledge. And we hope by interviewing some of the world's most successful entrepreneurs and change makers that you'll get the knowledge you need to become the person you want and turn your business into that dream company. I personally have started 17 companies from scratch and have invested in over 65 startups. When I sat down and analysed how I did it, I discovered a secret. It was all luck. I'm here to tell you, in my opinion, without luck, it ain't gonna work. Each week, I will discuss with my guests this theory and see if luck is a skill as I feel it is. I hope you enjoy our episode this week. Welcome to this week's episode of the Good Luck Club podcast. My guest today is writer Adele Lim. She's best known for being the screenwriter for Crazy Rich Asians. Adele, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Delighted to be here.
Do you mind starting off by telling the audience a little bit about yourself?
Oh, wow. Where to start? I'm a TV and screenwriter living in Los Angeles, but I was born and grew up in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and, really didn't get to the States until I was 19 for school. I always wanted to be a writer, I think. I think I wanted to write from the time I could write. But, growing up with conservative Chinese parents in Southeast Asia, the idea was, you can't possibly make a living as a writer. So I always had this idea of my future as, this unsuccessful novelist, just like living in squalor, surrounded by dogs. And happily, I came to the States, met a cute boy in college who said, I'm going to move to LA and write for TV. And I think prior to that, I never really thought that was an option. And, I think long story short, here I am.
No, I think it's interesting. You're lucky enough to know exactly what you want. A lot of my listeners are still trying to figure that out. How did that happen? How did you know what you want? You're so privileged.
It is one of those strange things. And I do feel I'm incredibly lucky that way of knowing exactly what I wanted to do from a very early age. I don't think there really was an option B. Everything I wanted to do was sort of an offshoot from writing, and I think, even thinking about it in much more practical ways, it was about, perhaps I could be a magazine editor or, write novels on the side. I think from, again, growing up in Malaysia, even from a young age, I think I was very aware of the fact that I was in a very small country in a very sort of, at that time, an unfashionable part of the world. And books really were this tremendous escape. And I think it was, like reading a ton of Enid Blyton and Woodhouse and Irma Bombeck that really sort of took me out of where I was. And again, not that where I was awful or bad or anything like that, but, the worlds it opened up, to sound completely earnest for a second, it really was a portal into, all these other existences and histories and ways of being that I couldn't even possibly imagine. And I think just the allure of that immediately from a very young age, I just could not get away from it.
But it feels like a big leap from consuming interesting content to having the ability to produce interesting content.
Oh, but, I think most kids have that. Like the second they watch a TV show or read something compelling, I feel like it's a very natural childlike instinct to immediately want to create a similar world. Like the first thing you do, it's like with language, like with anything, you just start mimicking and you start creating, like, putting in your own construct of what it is you've just consumed. And I don't know, I feel like a lot of young kids have it. And at some point, along the line, it gets drummed out of you.
Was there a moment where you sat down and wrote something and handed it to someone and they went, oh, this is pretty good, and you knew that you had something? Or was it more self-recognition of your talent?
I'm trying to think. I think the moment really, really, really is the first moment when somebody pays you for it. Because, it's not just your mom or your dad or your aunt saying, well, this is lovely, what you did. You just assume, everybody's just blowing smoke up your ass. But I think I was lucky enough at a young age, I think I was a teenager, I got a gig as an opinion writer for a national newspaper. And again, it was just, like idiot musings, like garbage musings of a teenager. And I would just write about my family. And I would exaggerate, I would just, spin yarns, but people found it entertaining. And I think the moment I got my first paycheck from that, of writing these articles, I thought, oh, damn, it's not just me. It's not just me who finds it, like endlessly entertaining. There are people out there who are willing to like pay good, hard cash for this. And, and people I didn't know started reacting to it or sending mail in. And I think that's when I felt that, what I had to say, that there really was an audience for it, that in a way, it really connected me with people, that what I was feeling and doing in my own, weird little hole was resonating with people I had nothing in common with.
I've listened to lots of things and read lots of things about you since you kindly agreed to come on the show. I felt I should know. I've become a super fan. I must say, I've become a super fan of you, and I think one of the things I really like about what you've done is the variety of work you've also done. You seem to have taken a lot of risks, but this is a very hard question, but I hope you don't mind me asking. Is there one thing that you've created that you're most proud of?
Oh wow, most proud of. I think I think with me, when it comes to things of what's your favorite, what do you think most, like it always changes week to week, year to year based on what I'm working on at the moment. And so for right now, what I'm most proud of is a project I've just come off of, which is a Disney animated feature, Raya and the Last Dragon. And it's a fantasy original movie from Disney. And although it's set in this fantasy world, it's inspired by Southeast Asia. And I just come from, many, many, many years of working in Hollywood, writing all, like, you mentioned, all these different genres, but I hadn't really had an opportunity to write about, a world that I was more familiar with. And every time I told a story, I'd have to sort of force it through this prism of somebody else's perspective. And luck would have it, off of Crazy Rich Asians and then Raya, suddenly I was, I've been given this opportunity to tell stories directly inspired from the world I grew up in. And so with this Disney feature, I cannot wait for the world to see it. I think the big thing for me in terms of why I feel so proud of it is, Disney as a company has this impact on the whole world. One of the first movies I'd ever watched was Snow White. I was very little, and we had it on a crappy VHS tape, and watched it endlessly. And my grandmother put up plays, and I was Snow White. Like it has that kind of an impact. But we're so used to seeing like a certain kind of princess or a certain kind of story being told. And with Raya and the Last Dragon, the public hasn't really seen it yet, but seeing the initial art for who this lead character is, and she's this little like dark brown skinned Asian girl running around kicking ass. It's just all my childhood fantasies come to life. Yes.
Is this character you? Is it you?
What? Oh no, I wish I was her. I think the best thing about the character is she's everything I wish I was when I was 8, everything I wish I was when I was a teenager. Just, brash and fearless, and out there making mistakes and doing the damn thing.
But I guess that's the premise. That's the premise of things like SpiderMan in a way, isn't it? I mean, he's complete the opposite to SpiderMan in many respects, right? He's weak. And,
yes.
He's intellectual but not necessarily tough. And then suddenly he can change into SpiderMan. Is it that type of thing, or is it just straight off? This person's just super strong and super clever and so on?
No, you know what? I think that's really a perfect analogy. I like to think that, now I'm sort of like, living in my truth and all that. But I think growing up, particularly in Malaysia, and you're always a little uncertain of yourself, especially if you're a young girl. There are all these things you're supposed to be, and you realize, you're sort of like falling short in so many ways, or at least you think you're falling short. It's all a game in your head. And I remember as a child just like being very cautious and not really taking a ton of risks, And I think it was just always this fun escape to be able to write a character that had none of those hangups, that could sort of, just boldly venture through life doing whatever the hell it is they felt like doing. And I think, having young kids and young girls being able to see someone like that who sort of reflects them, on screen is tremendous.
It's interesting. I think it's when you're making these amazing pieces of content. I know it's a collaboration, but when you're building it out, do you have a yardstick as to what success would be when the product's gone into the market?
I've given this is just specific to me, and I'm gonna caveat it by saying I love money, like making money and having that be sort of a measure of success. But when it comes to my own work, what I've realized is that I can't. It never serves me well to think about, this project that I'm developing, is what exactly is the market for it? What are the chances of it getting picked up? There are very successful writers, who are able to sort of look at the market, calibrate it, and, sort of churn out a piece of content they feel will do very well for that. And that's not really how I operate. I tend to, and I think a part of it is a function of, of the job. It is really easy for it to become a grind when you're, especially in television, when you're just grinding through and just breaking story 24/7. It's very easy for it to just feel like this rock that you're shoving up a hill. And I got to a place, several times in my career where I, would ask myself, why am I doing this? It's really not for the paycheck. And where I would get back to is that, I'd have to come from a place of joy. So it's a very long way of answering your question. But to me, success is, when you're pursuing a project and it really comes from a place of pure passion, pure joy. And when it goes out into the marketplace, it's not so much, what the box office is, but does it resonate with other people? Can people look at it and, watch it, experience it, and sort of, feel what you were feeling when you were creating it? That sense of authenticity. Was there a voice? Was there a character that they connected with? When you're in the writer's room or you're with producers and you're just grinding this thing out, it's so easy to lose perspective of, that these characters you bring to life, to someone else watching it, they're flesh and blood. And it's so easy to get sort of, lost in the minutia of technical details that, you want that creative thread to pull through for the result on the other end, for someone to realize what you did and respond to it. So I guess to summarize it, it's just coming from a place of passion and then really having someone, recognize it for what it is and appreciate it at the end.
This is one true fan concept. It's this, that one person's really enjoyed it and they've got something from it. I feel like
yes.
the way I look at the way your career's going, a lot of your content is also trying to inspire the younger you and in the culture you were in.
Yes, very much so. And I think growing up in a third world country really just makes you much more aware of the impact that content has. America, and I think to a large part the United Kingdom, they've just enjoyed being sort of the center of global culture for so long. And I think if you grow up American or British, you sort of take that for granted. Of course, you have all these great authors, all these great, composers, these great movie makers, in a way that if you grew up in a different part of the world, you don't have that. But you're still enjoying the fruits of it. You can still, and it does make a huge impact on your own life. I remember, again, growing up, I grew up with a ton of television. It was all the insane 80s TV shows, like Manimal and Automan. I mean, ridiculous concepts, but it just electrified your imagination. You're just thinking, oh my God, you can do anything. And I think just before I left for college, there was this show called Beverly Hills 90210. Again, ridiculous, heightened, if I were to watch it today, I don't know if I would say it holds up, but it just, really brought you into a different world. And, it just opens up your horizons in a way that, someone just telling you about it, or, or reading or watching a documentary about it doesn't quite do. You need it to sort of hit that lizard part of your brain. And, and it just spurs this curiosity about the world.
I think this cultural stuff is fascinating. I personally lived in Hong Kong for 20 years and lived in England for 20 years. And so it's fascinating. I grew up in England watching Hong Kong Phooey. I don't know if you know, so
Hong Kong movies are the best.
But when I went to Hong Kong, I just expected everyone to know karate, like, but isn't it funny how those entertainment programs can end up, I guess, illustrating what you think the culture is like? I mean, I think about Malaysia, for example. I mean, we in the West don't get content from Malaysia, but people in Malaysia get content from America.
Right.
So that's an interesting, I guess, problem in a way, because I think the cultural divide then is there more. Do you think that's true?
Yes. To the first thing you mentioned of, getting all your ideas of a different culture purely from a TV show is problematic. Kind
of the aliens. If the aliens were watching all the TV programs of England and they came to actually see us, it would be quite different, right? I mean,
right. Yeah. A bunch of like grumbly, snarky, dryly hilarious people.
Yes.
Well, I don't know. Maybe that's like.
Maybe that's actually true what the human race is like. I was thinking more like Superman. They'd come here and say, "Where's the guy that flies?" Or
Right. Right. Yeah. You have like obsessions with like, men in spandex.
Yes.
But, with 90210, you get the sense that, this is what all American cities are like. And so, when I went to school in Boston, and my sister ended up going to school in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And again, knowing nothing about Fayetteville, Arkansas, but just thinking, well, all American cities must be like Beverly Hills. And when she got to Fayetteville, was in for a rude shock. But I think, especially in this day and age and what's going on, in the streets in America, it's all bringing everything sort of full circle. We're all part of a piece, which is to say, like the world we depict in television and film is the world, that the rest of the world thinks it is. They think of America as being a certain way. When my parents first got to West, the first time they visited New York, it was this jarring experience of, our cab driver's Pakistani. Like, we expected everybody in America to be blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and it's funny in a way, but then it also becomes sad, and it sort of reinforces a problem of, saying to the world, well, only one kind of person gets to be the hero of the story. Only one kind of person, holds any weight. And we find their journey compelling, and nobody else even factors into it when when reality couldn't be further from the truth. America was really diverse and varied then; it's diverse and varied now, but you don't see a lot of those stories on screen.
How do you stay motivated to continue to produce content? You talked about this a little bit earlier, but the concept of being passionate about what you're producing. But I just look at your career. I mean, I actually had to look up digital monsters. I actually had to
God, no, you didn't.
I know. I didn't know it, but you've produced a lot of content. Let's just say that, over a long period of time. But how
Yes.
do you stay motivated to do that?
Well, it depends on where you are in your career. I think early on, you're just so, you're so hungry and driven. You're just happy to pick up whatever gig you can get, including Digimon Digital Monsters, which, by the way, insane. I think,
we might bring it back now on this podcast. I think there'll be a whole load of people searching for that, so we'll have to.
Oh dear God! Well, I mean, honestly, it's one of those things where we weren't even really writing. Like, they had just produced the whole series in Japan. It was already done. The stories were done. But those stories don't translate to an American, to American children, because they're doing stories on the mystic powers of Taoism, and that's what the monster's channeling. You tell that to, kids in Ohio, and they're like, what now? And so literally, it was one of those strange jobs where you have a whole Japanese cartoon and characters are moving their mouths, and you have to really re-script the whole story based on what's going on, but to make it sort of fit a different audience. So again, early forays in cross-cultural entertainment. But to your question of, where does the motivation come from? Let me tell you, there are a lot of days where there's zero motivation. There's a lot of days where you're like, damn, I'm under contract. It's a paycheck. I have just got to push through, and fear is your motivation. And that's fine. Like, a lot of times, like, deadline and a fear of failure is like the one thing that's driving you, and that is perfectly okay. But I think in the ideal world, it really does come from that place of excitement. And I think it shows. I think, like writing is often cast as a really sort of solitary pursuit, but the truth of it is for television, for film, it's incredibly collaborative. You're working with people right off the bat. You're pitching your vision, you're writing it. It goes through so many different formats, from from story areas to outlines to, all these millions of drafts. And, in working with all these people, if you have a certain vision and a passion for it, like they feel it. And they, even if they can't see, if they don't have the script in front of them and they can't see all the pieces and they, there are all these holes, they put enough faith in your passion and your faith in it. So I think, when I'm looking at a project, it is about that thing of like, how can I personally connect to this? Even if the characters in the world have like nothing to do with me. What is it about that experience or that journey that appeals to me now, or, appeals to like 8-year-old me? And if I can sort of find that and tap into that, at least, that's a great springboard.
One of my favorite writers and comedians is actually my neighbor, Ricky Gervais.
Ah, my God!
Yeah, and his content and philosophy is interesting. I'm a big fan, so I actually watch all the stuff he talks about too. And he talks about this concept that writers should own the work. Mm-hmm. And how do you feel about that? What's your view on that universe?
Help me define that. Own the work.
So, for example, he wrote The Office. Right,
yes.
And then it did quite well in England, and then he sold the rights to The Office to the US, and they did kind of what you just said there about Digital Monsters. They kind of repurposed it for the American market, with American nuances to working in an office. So basically, he's written the content. He's the creator and the producer, and then eventually he can syndicate it, and he's not. Yes. In other words, he's not necessarily working for. He's working for Netflix, at the end of the day, because they're the broadcaster for his recent show. But in a way, he's also independent, so he can create the content. Yes. He can create whatever content he wants, and they'll just put it on their platform because it will create lots of views and lots of interest. So I feel like the part of the question I'm asking too is the dynamic of a writer changing? Are you getting more power? Because I feel like 20 years ago, maybe when you started your career, in a way, you were working for someone else and that you needed them. But now with all these abilities to put stuff out there, is that changing?
Oh, definitely. I think, on a personal level, but it's also where you are in the industry. So, for people who aren't familiar, television is a writer's medium and film is more of a director and a producer's medium. So in television, the writer is king. So even if you're this shit kicker staff writer in your first year on a TV show, at least when I started, you were on set, you were the voice of the executive producers and you really had a lot of ownership over your own episode. Even if you did not create the show, in the ideal world, it's still your voice. It's still a story you pitched. It's still, world and characters you brought to life, and you're on set, on the ground, making it all happen.
I've suddenly got this image of all these actors coming up to you and saying, please don't kill off my character. You must have the power to write them out, so, but like, oh no.
Yeah, well, that would be, yes, like the showrunner. And yes, it does create a lot of anxiety among the writer cast, especially if you're one of those shows known for like, as a
Game of Thrones where you're like, oh my,
yes,
I'm out,
exactly.
I'm out, oh no.
That's right. Massive helicopter crash. Who made it? Tune into next season to see. And, you don't know. Let's keep it a big old secret. Let me see. What were we going on?
Oh, sorry, that's my fault for interrupting you mid-flow. Sorry.
No. Oh, that's right. You were talking about ownership, writers and ownership and having agency. So again, most of my career, I spent 17 years as a television writer, and ownership is everything to us. And I think it works a little differently in the British model, but in America, the showrunners are the writers. So you've created the show, you've sold it, you oversee all the aspects of it. Pre-production, production, you're running the writer's room and you're on set, and so you hold the whole thing. And yes, and it gets sold and, but really it's your show and you're sort of, you live and die by the success of your own show. And that's the model I was always used to, even if it wasn't my show necessarily that I was working on. I have run a show before. And, but I think when I transitioned over to movies, I carry that same sense of agency. And in movies, it is very different, because it's mostly held by the directors, by the producers, and their writers are viewed as much more expendable. Like a writer comes in, well, that's not working out. Well, toss out that writer, bring in new writers with the idea of like, I'll just keep throwing writers at it until, it works out. And, I have a very writer-centric point of view. I think there's a reason why we've been in the golden age of television for the last decade or so. When you look at the television landscape, the stories are amazing. They're tremendous. They're transporting. The level of writing, the level of storytelling is insane. And, for there to be some discrepancy between, the quality or level of storytelling in film and television is, horse shit. But again, it's an attitude, and it's a way that the industry has sort of evolved. But I think the difference with me, coming into features, I've, as TV writers, you've spent your 10,000 hours just grinding in the trenches, getting story out. You're very collaborative. You're not precious about any ideas, and I think those are all like skill sets that, have sort of worked out well, not just for me, but for a lot of writers who've transitioned from television into film.
So I think the English model, it's interesting just to understand the difference, but I feel like the English model is you can create the content and own it, and then you sell it as a piece of content. And when you're working on these shows, I guess what I'm asking, I mean, I basically see you as an entrepreneur in a way, because you're not necessarily fixed with one studio all the time or one project forever. You're not working for someone. You do a project with Disney, you complete that project, and now you're on to the next project. So it's very entrepreneurial. It's like having an agency. I've heard you talk about that before, about how your parents said, "Oh, good, maybe you can get a little agency," and and in a way you became a writer. But in a way, you are actually also an agency. You are a product that's.
I think I do think a lot of writers are, and there are things in television and writing where you get these overall deals where you are working for a studio for a number of years. And I've had an overall deal before, but I remember finding it just really constricting. I'd like to be able to find a piece of content that I fall in love with and develop it with whatever producers I want. And having that freedom versus having, sort of this overseer telling you, well, we're paying you a huge amount of money for the next 3 years. So, these are your options. But yeah.
There was a bit of controversy around Crazy Rich Asians and the movie number 2. Now I know everyone likes to talk to you about this, and it's always, oh no, this story again. But it is an interesting one, because in this age of equality and trying to achieve it, I feel like you stood up and said, no, that's not right. But how's that played out? In reality, has it affected your career in any way? Why did they not just pay you the equivalent amount of the other screenwriter? I mean, as soon as you get that highlighted, why don't they just buckle and pay you properly? What? I don't understand.
Well, I think, by the time the story came out, it was probably almost a year after, everything had gone down. So after the story had come out and everybody was properly shamed, they did come back to me with, well, let's work it out now. And by that time, I had already committed to Disney and was fully in love over there. And, it was just far too late. And also, I think in my mind, if it took a public shaming for you to get to this point, I really don't need this. And I think the part of me being willing to have the story come out, I didn't want to detract from Crazy Rich Asians at all. I love the movie. I love John Chu. I love the cast. And it had it gave such a warm feeling to the community. And the last thing I wanted to do was take away from that feeling. But, again, having, been in the industry for as long as I have, it really was a situation that I couldn't deal with. Like I know what I bring as a writer. I know that, Crazy Rich was what it was because of my experience in television, and I was used to making a certain amount. And, studios will talk a big game about, promoting inclusion and equity. But when it comes to the lawyers and business affairs, it's an entirely different story. And what I found, as a recurring practice in the industry was they will always cite things like precedent. Well, you may have worked all these years as a television writer, but really this was only your first movie. And so we're going to offer you like rock bottom minimum, because to do anything different would be to set, a terrifying precedent for future negotiations. And, and I know that there are always exceptions that are made. And if I could not get equity after the first movie was a success, I can't imagine what it's like for other feature writers. And I think, and the landscape of features is very different from television. It's much more diverse in television. And I do believe that that's why, you've got a bigger breadth of, and diversity in terms of stories being told. the way you don't in features. And when you look at just the simple breakdown of numbers, like I think the year Crazy Rich came out, something like 85% of like the top 100 grossing movies were written by white guys. And there's a dearth of, female storytellers, storytellers who are people of color. And there's a reason for that. And again, I don't think there's this big Illuminati of, white guys saying like, let's not tell the stories of brown women anywhere. But, again, because features are just, such the territory of, an individual director, he's going to be drawn to the kind of story that appeals to him, which chances are it's going to be a character that he looks like and he sounds like he can identify with. He's going to find a writer that can also embody that voice and tell that story. And so just by virtue of that, you're cutting out a lot of women and a lot of people of color. And so when we do have an opportunity to tell our stories, not, to have us not be, compensated equally, I felt was a slap in the face, and I knew I would not be able to work well under those circumstances, so I walked away.
Well, I think that's the right call, and I think your Wikipedia page needs to get updated soon with best known for the Disney animated feature film Raya and the Last Dragon. I'm going to personally update your Wikipedia page with that.
Could you?
So, yeah, because I think it's time. It's time to move on, and certainly, interesting. I just watched Crazy Rich Asians. I think I'm the last person on the planet to have watched it. So, so maybe I'm the full stop for you on that. But it's interesting. I married a Chinese girl, and watching some of those scenes. I mean, the dumpling scene, for example. I know it gets brought up a lot, but it really resonates with me. That kind of face-off respect thing. But how did that play out for you in your life? I without prying into your personal life, but you're married, I assume.
Divorced.
Divorced.
But,
okay.
Yes, but no regrets. And married a white boy from Boston. And again, I guess my biggest cross-cultural experiment.
And so, well, is it an experiment that didn't work out? How do you feel about that whole, pitch that even for me when I got presented to my wife's parents, it was very much like, is this just a fly-by-night thing, or is this, you should just be marrying within your own culture? Do you think that that's still a thing?
It really is a little bit of a thing. It's less of a thing now, but I think the part of that where I felt helped with Crazy Rich was this. And by the way, I apologize for my circuitous way of answering questions. But so in Crazy Rich, it's easy with a property like that to make it all about those insane, crazy, alien creatures living on the other side of the world with their ridiculous, outlandish ways. And I remember when I started working on it, that it was very important to me that people are laughing and experiencing life with the characters and not just laughing at them, if that makes any sense.
Total.
And so, it was grounding the Michelle Yeoh character. It can't, her issue with Rachel couldn't be just about money and class, because, that's about social classes, and Rachel is Chinese, so she's of the same culture. It wasn't like me when I brought my white boyfriend back to Malaysia and freaked everyone out. It's a slightly different dynamic. But where my parents' fear came from had to be the sort of the same fear that we were creating in the character of Michelle Yeoh, that it's not just about money and all the superficial trappings. It really is about the fear of a family losing their child. So and I can't speak to you and your wife, but I think with my family, it just wasn't, racism of she's marrying a white boy and why would she do that? He was somebody from a completely different culture in a completely different country. And so for them, they felt, justified that if she marries this person, she's going to be living somewhere else. Her children won't be completely of our own community, and we'll lose a little bit of her, and we'll lose a little bit of her future. And that is a fear I think people from all cultures recognize. Putting back into, my own relationship, I think it all worked out well in the end. It's just people dealing with that fear of loss, and really it's not about, I think, who you choose to marry in the moment. It's how you choose to live your life, and whether you continue to sort of nurture those relationships, and and have both parties sort of like be open to, I am living a different kind of life. I am living a life with a person different from someone you would have picked for me, but we can still be in this together, but we both have to be game.
Yes, totally. I mean, it's interesting because there is also, I mean, like you say, every culture has this. Even my own mother, who will probably listen to this podcast and tell me off for saying this, but she said Simon probably won't marry that one, meaning my now wife. And so there's racism in the system. It's almost built in. That's my mum just assumed because my wife was Chinese that I wouldn't marry her. Of course, I have married her. Now I've had a child, so it's all a bit awkward. When I bring this up with my mother, because my son therefore is also part Chinese. So it's very interesting though how I guess the cultural divide is there, and it's not just you bringing a white boy back to Malaysia. It's me bringing a Chinese girl to England.
Right.
So it's kind of a universal thing. That's what I discovered about living in Asia for 20 years and living in Europe for 20 years, that there's racism in both directions. There's
absolutely.
And maybe racism sometimes is also the wrong word. It's misunderstanding. It's just we're scared of what we don't know, right? I guess in a way.
I think that's exactly it. It is fear of the unknown. And when you fear something, it is much easier to cast aspersions on it. And I think particularly with the Hong Kong British relationship, or and Malaysia was a colony, that there is this sort of loaded history that gets packed into the way you see the other. And sometimes to make up for a feeling of either inferiority or whatever, you tend to ascribe all these terrible traits to the other party. So yeah, and I think again with everything that's happening on the streets over here, I think it's important to remember that we are all one and the same, and I mean that in the best ways and also the most terrible ways. Growing up with in an Asian culture, they're absolutely as racist as as anyone else. I think Americans have taken it to a brutal, awful extreme, but those inclinations are in all of us.
Totally, yeah. And I think that I'm almost embarrassed to tell the story about my mum being racist, but it's also good to recognize it because it's accidentally also probably in me. That as much as I can recognize that her statement's wrong, there's probably an element of me there that's got it just through osmosis, right? The subconscious piece.
Sure, I think it's in all of us, and I think what the last few weeks have really showed a lot of Americans is is this need now to sort of look within, and what ways have we inherited, and what systems are we perpetuating? And with your mother again, I don't think for a lot of it does not come from a malignant place. It just comes from a place of a lack of understanding and a lack of familiarity. And I think interracial marriages are a great way to get past it, and especially once children are involved, usually everything's forgiven. I think differences are out the window.
That's what I loved about the writing in Crazy Rich Asians, because you're catching the nuance at this point in that, like you're saying the scene where she says, I'm going to go see their family in Singapore, and the mother turns around and says, but they're not the same as us.
Yes,
they're not American kind of Chinese. There's subcategories of the category. So there's almost racism within the genre of the particular way you live right now. You might be Chinese, but these people are different. And that's what's fascinating. And I think the same with rich and poor. There's yes, these people that live in Singapore, they're Chinese, but they're poor. Again, another subcategory somehow, right? And I think that's the thing that a lot of people miss, that there's subcategory racism.
That's exactly it. And I think that really was also for the benefit of the Western audiences, because you don't have to tell the Asians we're very aware of all the differences we feel towards each other. But I think it really was a revelation for a lot of white America and the West was oh, so you guys have issues with each other. Well, of course we do. And growing up, there are all these things of just the overseas Chinese versus the mainland Chinese, and those people spit on the streets, or these people don't really know what their true cultural roots are, and also speaking to the diaspora of the Chinese everywhere in the world, and that we're very distinct little pods of we're little pods of wherever we ended up.
Yeah, and it's I mean, I when I look at your career as well, I feel like there's kind of two themes. It's an element of this superhero kind of breaking through, breaking the mold of what a superhero looks like. I mean, Xena, Warrior Princess is probably one example. But, like and then I think on the other side about, the other side of your career, I look at the Lethal Weapon series that you've done. I mean, Lethal Weapon, when I first read you did Lethal Weapon, I had to research, forgive me not knowing all of it instantly. But when I first saw it, I'm like, wow, you're not that old. You can't have done the movie. And then I realised you'd done the series. But a movie to me was always, this Mel Gibson character and a black and white man working together and getting to know each other's families. And well, Mel Gibson didn't have a family in the movie, but the concept, their culture were very different, right? The way they lived was very different. And I think that was part of the magic of the original Lethal Weapon series, right? That dynamic of understanding each other's background and culture, and how Danny Glover's character would take care of his family and how protective he was of his daughters. And I think that's part of what was the beauty of the original movie, right? So I feel like that dynamic, you've always been playing around with that dynamic in what you've created.
Well, with Lethal Weapon, that was the TV series was created by Matt Miller, and I think explicitly that dynamic you talked about was the reason that he really wanted to give life to the TV series. That one I can't take any credit for at all because I didn't set it up, and but yes, it is very alluring dynamic of with two characters. I mean, the rule in writing buddy cop shows is that thing of the contrasts. One person has like zero family and has a death wish, and the other one has a huge family and is in fear of lives in fear of death, and how like both sides sort of fill a hole in each other of like there is part of like the Murtaugh character that wants to be, wants to live balls out and be reckless, but he has to fight it, and he has to sort of yell at his partner for being that guy. And there's part of the Riggs character, as much of a kamikaze like lone warrior he is, that sort of longs for companionship and longs for that, yearns for that family life, even if he will never explicitly say it, but we feel it for the character. We want it. And that's why we want them both together.
That's so true.
And I think that's
so true. No, that's the dynamic that's magical, isn't it? And I think that's true in life, though, isn't it? It's sometimes the opposites attract, that kind of concept.
Yeah, and I think and I don't know if it's something I've pursued in my work, but it was absolutely there in Crazy Rich. I think even if we don't explicitly say it for Rachel and this guy, I think for her, again, we didn't make a huge meal out of it, but she's Asian American, and that's its own thing, its own experience. You're not like Asians who grew up in Asia. With my friends who grew up here, there was this sense of being the other. And I think when she looked at a guy like Nick, who grew up in Singapore, being like the prince among his people, there's you're just drawn to that, somebody who is like you, but is so confident and so at home in who he is that, you're drawn to that. And, and I think there's also a little bit of that in Raya and the Last Dragon. And, that one, I can't speak too much of the story, but, with the character of Raya and this dragon that she meets, there is also that, that yearning. And it always comes across as, you hate the way the other person is, but you're also really drawn to it and kind of want it for yourself a little bit.
When you start on a project like this, I mean, to me, again, I feel like, I built 17 companies from scratch. So I always look at this process of building things. But I actually look at every time you create these things, it's like building something from scratch. You don't know if it's going to succeed. You've done it a few times, of course, more than a few times. You kind of know what's involved, but you never know. I mean, when you're building these platforms out, do you see it as like something that when you're building it, it's going to be successful, or do you just feel it as you're developing it, or is it from day one when you pitch it, it's going to be successful? What goes through your mind?
Oh, good God. I think all writers feel this way, which is it doesn't matter how big a success you just came of. When you start a new project, you are starting from zero.
Yes, I feel the same.
Yeah, absolute zero, because you don't know. And we've all been through it enough where we know like there have been amazing concepts, amazing scripts where bidding wars have happened. And then when it gets produced and it gets made, it turns out to be this like dump on a log that nobody wants to spend 2 cents to go see. And, because there's so many things, it's such a collaboration, so many things could go wrong along the way. So even when you pitch it and you're feeling in your bones, at the back of your head, at any moment, at any turn, this whole thing could go off the rails. And so, I think this is an industry where like people with like control issues and, people are OCD like thrive, because you're constantly obsessing on all the details. especially if you're, in television and you're a producer, whether it's the casting, the script, like every little thing down to like, set design and, actor choices, just fully cognizant of the fact that, everything could hinge on a couple of like key decisions, how an actor comes across, how a whole thing. And so much of it is alchemy too at the end. Like, you don't know, like you created these characters, these actors have sort of brought it to life, but who knows, like on the day of, they're in the wrong outfit, in the wrong thing, they're not feeling it. And if they're not feeling it, then, the viewer isn't feeling it. So, I really, similar to your experience of like starting, different companies, that feeling of like, yes, this is another opportunity for success or total devastating, humiliating failure.
Do you have fear like that? Even now it's made, it's coming out. When is it released, by the way? When can we?
It was supposed to be released in November, but because of the pandemic and everything, now it's slated to be released in March.
Why wouldn't you not get it out right now? Disney's hot. My whole crew, we were all talking about this before the broadcast today, about how everyone's downloaded Disney Plus because of the lockdown, and there's not enough content at the moment because they want to watch more stuff. So
yes,
why would they delay it?
Oh, you'll have to ask like the masters of the universe, like
good
running the
PR
Disney
response. Yeah.
But they did have a lot of movies that were slated to come out,
right,
that they have released on Disney Plus, and so they're just hoping to get back to the box office, I'm sure.
But do you? You must be already planning your next project or next thing, I guess, or
yes.
Is it? Oh, you are. Okay. Are you allowed to talk about that, or you're not?
Always. Oh yeah, a little. So I think it was a reaction of like being on Disney for a while, because I think I was on it for almost 2 years. But while I was on it, just for shits and giggles, me and my two friends wrote this completely inappropriate, raunchy, nasty comedy about 4 girls, like going to Asia, and it's just between us. I think the premise of it was the lead character was an Asian American adoptee in Middle America with like corn-fed, all American Midwestern parents, and she's going to Asia to look for her birth mother. But really, among us, when we talked about it, it was girls going to Asia in search for meaning, identity, and dick. I say that on your podcast.
Oh, you can, yeah. We don't have any. Spotify might censor it, but we definitely don't. We'll just assume that's a character's name.
Yes.
Perfectly
Richard
fine
Law
then. Dick, the character, yeah.
Beijing.
In
That's
Asia.
right. There you go. Mm-hmm. That's right. Name of her birth father. That's how we'll get it through the censors.
Yeah. Richard. Some people call him Richard, but
That's
yes. Anyway,
right.
yeah. Off to Asia they are to find themselves. Yeah.
Yeah. So we wrote a fun movie. Attached ourselves as producers because again we're all television writers, and it's that feeling of wanting agency over our work. And that's why we wrote it on spec instead of pitching it around town and having someone pay you to write it. That we just wrote it on our own, so that we knew like this is the story we wanted to tell, this is the movie we wanted to produce, and we sold it. We partnered with Point Grey, which is Seth Rogen's company, and we sold it to Lionsgate. And the pandemic sort of thrown a wrench into things, but hopefully it all comes out in the wash at the end.
Is that normal sequence? Is that something you've done before? You produce something and sell it like that, or is that a new route?
That's a new. I think a lot of writers. Well, I wouldn't say a lot of writers. Some writers do that where they just write something entirely on spec, whether it's a TV show or a movie. It doesn't happen as often because it is a huge investment of your own time, and there's no guarantee that you're going to be paid for it. Versus, being able to go out, pitching something and having someone pay you for it. But the issue is that, and I'm sure it's the same in business, which is the moment the moment somebody else is financially invested in it, or is, it is the outsized financial partner in something, they have control over what it is you do. So, and I'm fine partnering with people. I'm a big fan of collaboration, but I think in the nascent part of the process, when you're just trying to find out what it is you're excited about, sometimes it's important to just do it on your own. And I think that's what me and my co-writers felt, that we just wanted to write this and be free to go down all kinds of like wrong roads, go down all kinds of bad paths just because we can, just to see where it takes us. And, and I'm glad we did it.
Well, I'm excited. Is it got a title yet? Can we?
Not yet.
Okay. Well, again, I will update the description as soon as we're allowed to with exactly what this is all about. But I'm excited to watch it. I love anything that has background in Asia, because I'm in London now, so I'm seriously missing. Well, when I saw Crazy Rich Asians, sorry to keep jumping back to that, but I just couldn't stop thinking about dumplings and skylines. So yeah, keep doing stuff in Asia, please.
Love it.
I think it's there's a lot of my listeners that I know, for example, have stories they want to tell and they want to write them. And I think a lot of people would dream of being able to write a piece of content that gets picked up by Lionsgate and Seth Rogen. I think that would be a lot of people's absolute dream. They've got content out there. Is there an easy route to do this, or is it really still about who you know?
There is no easy route to do this. And to be absolutely blunt, it is an ass bleeding to, in the most pleasant terms.
Ass bleeding. I think Spotify will not bleep that out if we try and reference it back to Mr. Ass bleeding. What are the Mr. men? Yeah, he's a new one. You've not.
I'm so sorry.
Mr. Bump's best mate, but
I've got such a potty mouth. It's just,
No, I don't. I think people.
I'm a feral beast.
Honesty. That's what I like.
Listen, it's difficult. It really is. But I think now there are more avenues than ever for outsiders to break in. And a lot of the ways are these writing fellowships that are, sponsored by all the major studios, like CBS has one, Universal has one, Disney has one. There are all these writing fellowships where you can write material and submit it in, and then, get into the fellowships, work with professionals to really get your material up to snuff, to help you as a person understand how to present yourself at meetings, how to work with others, to familiarize yourself with the process, which can seem really opaque if you're coming in from the outside. And I think that was the second part of your question, in terms, that's right, who you know. There is a thing of who, being able to network and being able to get an in. But to me, that's, maybe 10 or 20% of the effort. I think when I was breaking in, there was this attitude of, it's all who it's whose uncle can get you an internship and who can get you into this writer's room as a PA. But that having an opportunity, has nothing to do with whether you yourself are ready for that opportunity and whether you have the work to back it up. At the end of the day, for a writer, it all comes down to your sample. And, for your listeners who want to tell their stories, you have to ask yourself, are you willing to put in the work to tell it? And, if you are, then, I think the first step is, doing, two things: getting your ass in the chair and writing nonstop. Don't be too precious about it. There are a lot of, early writers or would-be writers who are sort of holed up in a corner of their room, writing outlines, endless outlines for the book or the script that will one day be, but just has, it has to be perfect. Your first script's not going to be perfect. Your first script is going to be a dumpster fire. I don't know how else to say this. There are, it's the exception rather than the rule. If you come up with this, your first script and it's, and it's magic and someone says, let's shoot that. Even with experienced, amazing writers, unless you're Quentin Tarantino, that just doesn't happen. And so, it's putting in a lot of work there. And the good news is, in this day and age, between YouTube, the online communities, and all the resources out there, and you have a lot of writers who are, I feel like as a tribe, we're a very giving people. And so we're always out there trying to, share and teach and learn. There are all these online seminars, Q&As on Instagram, on Facebook with writers. I would, absorb as much as you possibly can. Watch, whatever it is you're trying to write. If it's a TV show, it's a film, watch all the TV shows and movies that are as close to the genre you're trying to write. Study it as an art form. Break it down, break down the craft. Because writing, I really do feel it's this perfect combination of the creative and craft. And so, it's working on both parts of it. And, really, it's just hours and hours of writing and just honing your craft. And then, when you're ready, or even before you're ready, just getting it into the hands of the right people. Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in your belief around things like luck. So I have a whole theory, and the reason I call the podcast the Good Luck Club podcast is because I don't think luck is talked about enough in people's process of being successful. And so my premise is that there's actually in the dictionary only one definition of luck, which is this random luck. And let's call it where you're born, for example. You can't really control where you're born. But then there's a second piece of luck that I think is more, you can influence it and you can control it with lots of different elements. So I think there's actually 3 elements that make you more lucky. But I'm interested in your view. I mean, do you feel that you were lucky in your career, or that luck isn't really a part of it? How do you feel about the concept of luck?
Oh, it's a big question. I've always felt like an incredibly lucky individual, and I'm not particularly religious or spiritual in that way, maybe when I was younger, but always just felt that, I think there's providence. There's things of like where you're born, and, and again, I don't know if it's strange, but I would say I was lucky to be born in Kuala Lumpur, and I was lucky to be born an outsider. I was lucky to be born a woman. I think like all those different things, and in a way being an outsider to sort of like global mainstream culture did give me a unique insight into that. And I think I've gotten to the place in my life where I believe in good luck, and I don't really believe in bad luck. An example would be when I was a TV writer. It used to be that there was staffing season because everything was in network, 1 hour on a network 1 hour schedule. And there was only a finite amount of time where all the TV writers would take all the meetings to get on your next big show. And I'd always felt, like I had, I was lucky. I was an immigrant. I was outsider, but I always staffed year after year, except for this 1 year where I was pregnant. And it was one of those things where like I was a million months pregnant. There's no hiding that. And, even though it's not legal for someone to not hire you because you're pregnant, no one's hiring, the 8-month pregnant lady because it's going to take up a huge part of your writer's budget. So, you could say like, oh, well, it's bad luck. Like I couldn't time my pregnancy out in time. I had zero control out of it. I was so angry. But it also turned out to be, my best bit of luck, which is I met a showrunner, Liz Tiglar, and we hit it off, right away. And there was a love connection. And because of my pregnancy, her show ended up being a mid-season, so it started a little bit later. And because, I couldn't staff on any other show that would have perhaps hired me had I not been pregnant, I really found the showrunner who, whose sensibilities and mind like matched so beautifully. And that ended up being one of those biggest breaks, one of my biggest breaks as a writer, because I got onto her show. I was also so, thankful and grateful that, she saw the writer in me past, my big, huge bump and, really gave it my all. And that was my first experience, running a writer's room. And I think had it not been for the bit of bad luck, I wouldn't have run into the bit of good luck. And I found, a similar pattern with my whole career. Anytime something has come up where I didn't get a job I thought was going to be the end all be all of my career, something else turned up. And, half of it was probably because I was so driven or angry at the thing that had preceded it. But, I firmly believe, like, especially for writers, that there really is no one big thing that is going to make or break you. And, more often than not, it's the opportunities you miss that is going to give you the motivation to really make the next thing take off.
I think that's such a good piece of insight there that I think so many people, it's about perspective, isn't it? That's primarily part of it. And I've had in my 17 businesses I've done, I've only ever been involved in one that involves talented writers. We actually made a comic book. Part of the concept was, and now I feel like I'm pitching it to you, but what if Superman landed in India? What would that whole thing, how would it
love it?
Yeah, and
done.
Yeah,
sold.
Done. Sold. Yeah, and then we brought this whole comic book out, which was basically superheroes in India that then come out and tell their story. Anyway, I invested heavily in it. Hired a brilliant team of writers. Ben Hall, big shout out to him, who was the writer on it. And we got invited by, this is 10 years ago, so I'm even scared to say his name now, but 10 years ago, Harvey Weinstein was interested in buying it. And at the time, we thought this was great, and then long story short, the deal fell apart. And how glad am I today that deal fell apart? I would not want to have my name associated with that person in any way, right? So that kind of dodged a bullet, but not at the time, in fairness. Not at the time, I didn't know anything, as many people didn't know anything about what he was up to. And you just think this guy, he's the guy that turns your comic book into a movie. He's the guy that will get us an Oscar for our comic book concept, like this is the person to deal with. And so, but we felt very unlucky at the time that didn't go ahead because the business then fell over. It didn't work.
What? You were ahead of your time. Like 10 years ago, yes, Indian superheroes might have been a harder sell, and now now with all these different platforms and this thirst for content, get out there,
right,
out.
I'm going to send you a copy now. I feel like I might have got someone on side in the US.
There you go.
So it fell apart with Harvey Weinstein, but I make the deal with you. But to your point, which I think is really good, that people out there, that I had someone email me yesterday, and I get hundreds of emails from people around this sort of thing, and they say, I have nothing but bad luck. And I say, this whole Buddha saying, which is everyone's going to have 10,000 hours of good luck and 10,000 hours of bad luck, and I think you can actually have 20,000 hours of luck if your perspective on it is right. So it's true what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, look, I always like to end the podcast with a light-hearted question, and I think it's light-hearted, but people have accused me of it being quite serious recently. But if you went back to your younger self and gave some advice, maybe that, before you left Malaysia, the 18-year-old you, what would the advice be?
Don't be afraid of anything, and it's all bullshit.
I can't see you being afraid at that point anyway. I can't see you being afraid. Were you afraid?
I think back on this a lot. There was the night before I left for the States. And, your family comes over, your friends come over. It's a big weepy thing. And then everybody goes home. And I couldn't sleep all night. And I was just pacing up and down my garden, like the family's garden, looking up into the night sky, going just like, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. It's all too much. It's like, the whole life I've been waiting for, like, it's going to happen. I'm going to take a plane and go to it tomorrow. I was like, don't fuck it up. Just go.
But you thought you were flying into 90210, didn't you? I mean, that's...
Yes, with 90210, but then you're excited to fly into 90210, but at the back of your head, you don't belong in that world. You don't have those cars. You're not some cute white girl with a tight ass. Like, how's it going to work out for you?
Yeah, I have the same problem.
But yeah,
wonderful.
But yeah.
Oh, your insights are great. Well, I kind of want to say, if your life was a TV show or a movie, what would the title be? I don't know if that's something you want to write, and maybe that's your next project after your recent project.
Oh God, the title would be The Angry Glutton, and I don't think I could sell that to Netflix.
I don't know. My son's reading Gruffalo at the moment, and that seems to be quite popular.
We're
going to need an Asian version of Gruffalo. Maybe there's a mash up there. I don't know.
Yeah, that's how you've like achieved true equity, when you've got like an Asian girl like just being a sort of completely self-destructive, like indulgent bacchanalian mess.
Awesome. Well, if you do write that TV show or movie, or write that book, I will buy it and I will watch it. So thank you so much, Adele.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for giving your time, and I hope to have you back on the podcast one day. Maybe we can talk about your new show when it's out, and discuss the creative process and how it all played out, so people can understand if they're ever interested in being a screenwriter and a creator.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Good Luck Club podcast. We know you have thousands of podcasts you could be listening to, and you've chosen us. We, of course, feel lucky. If you want to hear more, please go to thegoodluckpod.com or go to any of our social media pages and share with us your views, your insights, and any way that we can improve what we're doing to make it a better experience for you. We wish you the best of luck.